What you're observing is the initial genuine sovereign default of 2026. And it occurred before Wall Street even illuminated the premises. This is not a drill. It is not a social media rumor. And it is not a simulation. It is a confirmation straight from port representatives in Shanghai that as of December 31st at 11:47 p.m. local period, they began refusing silver shipments headed for COMEX-approved vaults in the United States. The default clock is not about to commence. It already activated. And when New York picked up the phone for an emergency lifeline to Beijing, the line didn't merely ring unanswered. Beijing effectively terminated the call. China stated zero to the bailout. Zero negotiation, zero counter-offer, merely zero. Earlier currently, I informed you we possessed roughly 48 hours before the framework hit a hard deadline. That timeline merely imploded. Those 48 hours have collapsed into less than 8 because contacts inside China are confirming something that was not supposed to occur until January 1st. The novel export restriction on strategic metals is being enforced ahead of schedule, not at midnight on New Year's, right now. And COMEX is going to open on January 2nd, confronting a physical delivery emergency that cannot be fixed with more paper guarantees. This is the event horizon for the silver marketplace. This is the point where a synthetic pricing framework constructed on leverage and derivatives collides with the reality that the underlying asset is merely not available at the posted price or at any price. When the physical disappears, the mathematics that underpins the paper marketplace ceases operating. And over the last 12 hours, while most individuals were counting down to midnight, the individuals who actually operate the framework were scrambling at 40,000 feet to halt exactly this result. Here is what has occurred, documented and reconstructed from flight information, exchange notices, and individuals who were in the room. At 2:14 p.m. Eastern yesterday, a Gulfstream lifted off from JFK bound for Hong Kong. Public flight records display the tail number and the destination, but the passenger list is blacked out. The individuals observing that ramp stated it wasn't tourists on that jet. It was senior individuals from JP Morgan's Commodities Group, at least one high-ranking representative from the CFTC, and someone from the Chicago Fed. Ask yourself a straightforward inquiry. Why is a regional arm of the Federal Reserve involved in what appears on paper like a private metals transaction? Because this is not merely about a few bars of silver. It is about the plumbing of the financial framework. It travels through swap desks, margin calls, and collateral chains straight into the foundation of the banking sector in under 3 days. The individuals on that plane comprehended it. That is why a central banker was positioned next to a commodities trader at 30,000 feet attempting to improvise a rescue before the holiday weekend was concluded. The jet touched down in Hong Kong at 6:40 a.m. local period on December 31st. By 9:15, the delegation was across the water inside a conference room at the Shanghai Futures Exchange's headquarters. Zero cameras, zero press, merely a handful of Americans, a table full of Chinese representatives, and one proposal. The U.S. side positioned a single straightforward offer on the table. An emergency purchase of 50 million ounces of silver cleared for immediate export. Compensation would not be in dollars that could be sanctioned. It would be in US Treasuries wrapped in a bilateral currency swap. So, the transaction bypassed SWIFT completely. And the lawyers had threaded the needle utilizing an obscure carve-out from the 2019 Phase 1 Commerce Agreement, labeling it a strategic reserve transfer instead of an export to dodge the novel Chinese regulation scheduled to bite on January 1st. On paper, it was clever. In reality, it reeked of last-minute panic. Beijing took the proposal, stepped out, and examined it for merely over half an hour. Not days, not weeks, 37 minutes. Then the head of the People's Bank of China's Metals Division walked back in, looked the Americans in the eye, and stated a single term. Zero. Not, we require more period. Not, what if the price is higher? Not modify the conditions. Merely zero. The meeting was concluded by 10:52 a.m. Shanghai period. By 1:30 p.m., the American delegation was back on the jet. And by 4 p.m. Eastern, the first Shanghai port began stamping silver containers bound for U.S. vaults with 3 terms. Zero individual on Wall Street desired to observe. Export clearance denied. This is not online speculation. 3 separate logistics companies that specialize in relocating refined bullion have reported the same element. Pallets of silver on the quay, container sealed, trucks idling with nowhere to relocate. The paperwork now carries a red stamp blocking shipment pending regulatory compliance review. That language is code. It signifies the novel export controls are not a future threat. They are active right now and they are being utilized to seize control of the last-minute supply headed toward the United States. So, let's be brutally clear about what that signifies. Through unofficial channels, channels. The US government merely attempted to quietly purchase a massive slug of physical silver from China to halt COMEX from exploding, and China refused. They didn't haggle for a higher price. They didn't insist on different collateral. They rejected the complete reasoning of the transaction. This ceased being about dollars and cents the moment that zero hit the table. This is about who controls genuine resources in a framework constructed on paper IOUs. Beijing looked straight at the US derivative structure and stated, in effect, you operate a casino of guarantees. We maintain the actual metal and we are not going to sacrifice our strategic stockpile to rescue your paper game. When the mainstream outlets finally bother to cover this, you will not hear it described this manner. You will be informed it is a commerce dispute. You will hear about tariff retaliation, regulatory compliance, and routine enforcement of updated export regulations. Bloomberg will trot out a polite euphemism. CNBC will position someone in a suit on screen to state with a straight face that commodity flows are being optimized. What you will not hear is anyone ask why a Fed representative was on that flight, why the CFTC required to sit inside a supposedly private negotiation, or why a straightforward purchase of metal required the blessing of two governments and a currency swap. If they ask those inquiries out loud, they would be forced to admit the evident. The paper marketplace is wobbling on a foundation that is missing most of the metal it guarantees. So, what exactly occurs when COMEX opens on January 2nd? As of the close on December 30th, there were around 12,000 active futures agreements standing for January delivery. Each agreement controls 5,000 ounces, that is 60 million ounces of silver that on paper has to be delivered over the subsequent month. The latest information displayed about 41 million ounces in the registered category, signifying they are supposedly available for delivery. You didn't require to be a genius to observe a gap already there. 60 million owed, 41 million in the bin, a 19 million ounce hole before you even factor in delays or withdrawals. Now, layer in the component nobody on TV is going to spell out. Of that 41 million, more than half, about 23 million ounces, was not actually positioned in New York vaults. It was scheduled to arrive in the initial week of January, largely refined in Chinese facilities and loaded onto vessels headed, you guessed it, through Shanghai. Those are the very cargoes now positioned motionless behind red-stamped paperwork. In other terms, in genuine conditions, COMEX does not possess 41 million ounces available. It possesses more like 18 million that are actually in the vaults and deliverable. Accomplish the subtraction. 60 million owed, 18 million available. That leaves roughly 42 million ounces of demand with nothing to meet it. A 70% shortfall. In anything resembling a free marketplace, a 70% hole in deliverable inventory would activate a violent repricing. Futures would gap higher. Shorts would scramble to purchase back agreements. Longs would fight to stand for delivery, and the price would relocate until someone somewhere was willing to part with actual metal. That is how price discovery is supposed to operate. But this is not that kind of marketplace. This is a marketplace where the price is established by leveraged paper trading and the underlying asset has merely been pulled out of circulation by the one major producer willing to state zero. If you desire to observe how the rulemakers respond when that occurs, you don't require a leak. You can read it yourself. Tucked away on the CME Group's website at 11:34 p.m. Eastern on December 30th, an emergency advisory went live under a deliberately boring title, Temporary Position Limit Modifications Under Force Majeure Conditions. 8 pages of legal boilerplate, but one paragraph matters, buried in Section 4C. The clearinghouse grants itself the authority in the occurrence that physical delivery cannot be reasonably completed due to circumstances beyond the control of the exchange to force cash settlement at the prevailing futures price without penalty to the short side. Translate that from legalese. Before the marketplace even opens for their crucial delivery month, the exchange is giving itself permission to state, we're not going to provide you the metal you contracted for. We're going to mail you a check instead at a price we establish and the party that failed to deliver owes zero extra expense for defaulting. That is not danger management. That is pre-authorizing a default and stapling the term force majeure on it to make it appear respectable. And examine the timing. Who is scanning CME regulation modifications about position restrictions at 11:34 p.m. on December 30th while most normal individuals are packing up for New Year's Eve? Not your average retail retail investor, not your pension fund. That timing is a signal to one audience. The substantial financial institutions that require to comprehend the regulations will be bent in their favor before the bell rings. Here is what that translates to on the ground for anyone still clinging to a January futures agreement, thinking they are obtaining bars of metal. When the music ceases, they are likely to be handed a dollar quantity anchored to a futures price around $30 an ounce, even as physical silver in Shanghai is changing hands near 90. A spread of $50 to $60 between the genuine reality expense of metal and the forced cash price on your agreement is not a rounding error. It is legalized confiscation carried out in the open through regulation modifications almost nobody reads. Now step back from the silver pits and examine the plumbing behind the scenes. While you were observing the ball drop in Times Square, the Federal Reserve quietly pushed $34 billion into the overnight repo marketplace. On the surface, the explanation will sound harmless. Year-end funding requirements, standard liquidity operations, nothing unusual except that merely days earlier on December 29th, the injection was around $4 billion. On December 30th, it was about $6 billion. Then suddenly on December 31st, it jumps to $34 billion. An increase of more than eightfold in 48 hours. Markets don't suddenly require 8 times as substantial overnight cash because traders are feeling festive. They require it because substantial players are staring down collateral calls they cannot meet. The repo marketplace is where financial institutions relocate when they possess good collateral but not enough cash, and they require that cash for a single night to remain inside the regulations. When the Fed has to arrive in with a fire hose on New Year's Eve, it signals that more than one major institution was in danger of failing the test. And when that surge lands on the exact same day that China slams the door on emergency silver exports, it doesn't take a conspiracy theorist to link the two. Silver is not some fringe metal. It is posted as collateral behind an estimated $200 to $250 billion in derivative exposure in the U.S. banking framework alone. Here is the basic chain. A financial institution like J.P. Morgan sells silver futures it does not possess fully backed by physical bars. To hedge, it purchases derivatives, swaps, and options from other institutions. Those in turn are priced off the COMEX benchmark, the paper price. That benchmark is influenced by algorithmic trading, high-frequency strategies, and yes, outright suppression when required. As long as physical bars can be sourced somewhere in the reality at a modest premium to that paper price, the game operates. You can always quietly relocate into the marketplace, compensate a bit over spot, deliver the metal, and close the record. But that only operates as long as the physical is actually for sale. Once Shanghai determines it will not ship, the modest premium transforms into a canyon. Right now, the future settlement price in New York is positioned in the low 30s. The spot price for immediate physical delivery in Shanghai is hovering near 90. That is a gap of almost $60 an ounce. So, imagine you are a financial institution that sold a futures agreement at $30, was counting on Chinese refineries to supply your bars, and now your customer states, "I desire delivery." You do not possess the metal. To perform, you have to find actual bars in a marketplace that desires $90. You deliver $90 metal against a $30 liability. You lose $60 per ounce. Multiply that by the 42 million ounces that COMEX cannot match with registered inventory and you are staring at roughly $2.5 billion in hard realized losses. And that is merely on the exchange-traded component. You can observe the bulk of the danger exists in over-the-counter swaps and structured products that pension funds, hedge funds, and corporates purchased as insurance. When those purchasers realize the exchange is forcing cash settlement and the physical is gone, they will relocate to enforce every line of those agreements. That is where the notional exposure around $230 billion matters. You're suddenly in region that feels very familiar. Cascading claims, nervous counterparties, collateral that isn't where everyone thought it was. Different asset, same movie. It appears substantially like 2008. Merely with silver bars standing in for subprime mortgages. So, the Fed races into the repo marketplace to make certain the financial institutions do not miss their overnight funding. The CME rewrites its own regulations to shield the shorts from genuine penalties, and the official narrative apparatus spins up to inform you everything is under control. You will hear that silver's price action is profit-taking after a speculative run-up. You will hear that Chinese export strategy is merely tightening enforcement and that the rise in repo operations is normal for year-end. Those lines are not random. They are crafted to purchase period while the institutions closest to the blast radius reposition themselves. The uncomfortable reality is that the paper-silver marketplace is now in the early stages of a structural failure. The bailout attempt failed. The supplier of last resort selected to keep its metal. The exchange has laid the groundwork to modify the regulations mid-game, and the central financial institution is patching holes in the plumbing with tens of billions of overnight dollars. You're observing in genuine period a default that is not being called a default. Agreements guaranteeing metal are being quietly converted into cash at a price that no longer matches the reality, where individuals actually melt silver and construct elements with it. This is what a contemporary sovereign default appears like when the element that breaks is not a bond coupon but a commodity guarantee. A government and its financial framework constructed a mountain of leverage on top of a metal they do not control. The moment the holders of that metal refuse to play along, the illusion cracked. From here on out, the gap between paper claims and genuine resources is not a theoretical discussion. It is a line item on balance sheets, a spread on price screens, and a narrative the individuals in charge are desperate for you not to comprehend until they have already escaped to the lifeboats. If this provided you a novel perspective, hit subscribe. History possesses the answers. I'll demonstrate you where to look.